Yeah, so good morning, everyone. So Dave Detwiler, I am a full-time pastor. I've actually been in the ministry for 35 years. And because of that, if you happen to know what week we are now entering, I'm not going to be able to stay for the rest of the morning, unfortunately. But I'm really glad that I'm able to at least present. About 10 or 12 years ago, I stumbled into researching history related to American bands. I'm a longtime tuba player and sousaphone player at the University of Southern California in a prior life, a long time ago. And I, at one point, just started poking my nose around the early history of the sousaphone, and that just kind of sucked me into just finding out more about American bands. I found my way, through John Philip Sousa and the history surrounding him, and then before him, P.S. Gilmore. And along the way, I started finding a lot of interesting information about subcontrabass tubas. So I've been able to research and write about mostly tuba-related things, but certainly as it relates to Gilmore and Sousa, since the sousaphone appeared shortly after that transition period. But about 4 years ago, Brian Proshk and George Foreman, if you happen to know either of them, invited me to contribute a chapter to this book that is coming out, I think, this week. I believe on Amazon. It's scheduled to come out on the 26th of March. It's called Bands in American Musical History, and they created that. That book as a way to honor Frank Cipolla. They originally were going to be honoring Raoul Camus as well, although he was honored in a different way, and so they ended up focusing the book as an honor to Frank. And when Brian asked me if there was a topic that I had been researching that I would love to dig into, I said, yeah, as I've been digging into especially the very first sousaphone player, a guy named Hermann Conrad, who, by the way, was 6'6", German soldier immigrant. I realized that he was originally in the Gilmore band and then joined Sousa's band, and then shortly after that became the first human being to play a brand new instrument called the sousaphone. So I thought, as I was researching that period between Gilmore and Sousa, there was just so much fascinating aspects to the story that I thought that's worth digging into. And Brian loved that. He said, good, that's your chapter. You're going to write a chapter about that transition from Gilmore to Sousa. So I've got some slides that'll help make it visually interesting, and I'm going to read a very, very condensed version of the chapter, and I'll try to make it interesting as I read. And then hopefully that'll take about 20 minutes, and that'll leave us with about 5 or 10 minutes. If there's any questions you have, I also have a couple of handouts I'll give you just to give you access to some of the funnest part of my research. But let me jump in here. It was billed as a musical event extraordinary featuring a military band without a rival, although one that had never actually performed in public yet. When the night of the concert arrived, John Philip Sousa mounted the podium and faced his newly formed band of 50 of the highest class artists and soloists. But instead of launching into the first number on the program, the men rose to their feet and performed the somber strains of P.S. Gilmore's The Voice of a Departing Soul. This was the debut of Sousa's new Marine Band on September 26, 1892, but the audience was understandably subdued. A mere 2 days earlier, while at the St. Louis Exposition with his band of 100, Gilmore, who was hailed as the world's greatest bandmaster, unexpectedly died in his hotel room. And upon hearing this stunning news, Sousa wisely made the last-minute change to his program. But even before the downbeat of that stirring piece, at least one newspaper had already declared that with the passing of Gilmore, Sousa was now the greatest bandmaster in the country. Now, when you examine the careers of these two musical giants during the period from about 1885 to 1893, it becomes real clear that their stories became very much intertwined. And basically with Gilmore unwittingly setting the stage for the rise of Sousa. And while my study is not the first to kind of poke around this topic, it's going to revolve around three particular, what I'm going to call phases or maybe eras in that time period that represents this kind of symbolic passing of the baton from the father of the concert band in America, which is what Gilmore was known as, to the March King, Sousa, of course. So phase one is what I call the era of the Blakely brothers. You might say, Blakely brothers? I thought there was just a Blakely. Follow me here. Looming large in the stories of both conductors is David Blakely, the successful businessman and self-proclaimed musical crank, that's what he liked to call himself, who was also quite tall. He was 6'4" to be exact. He was born, it seems, to manage a newspaper, which he did for no less than 8 papers during a period of 29 years. But his first love was music. And by 1884, when he was editing his 7th paper, he took charge of the Philharmonic Association of Minneapolis, and he set his sights on bringing to their fall music festival that next year P.S. Gilmore and his famous band. Now, 8 years later, David recounted how that came about, and here's what he wrote. He said, "When, after several repetitions of my application to Mr. Gilmore to come to Minneapolis, failed to receive any reply, I went all the way down to Louisville to have a personal interview with him." And then here's what he goes on to write about that interview. He says, "Gilmore apologized to me for failing to reply to my letters, and then said that he had no manager. He said, however, that if, after the St. Louis Exposition, which was to replace the Louisville Exposition in 1885, if I would lay out a route for him between St. Louis and Minneapolis and return, that he would undertake the enterprise. I thought it over for a while, and being very anxious to get Mr. Gilmore to Minneapolis, I undertook the work as proposed." So eventually everything was in place for Gilmore's band to tour its way to the Twin Cities in early November of 1885, and the excitement was at a fever pitch. And while a Blakely was mentioned as the manager of that tour, it was not David, but rather his older brother Zara, who went by Z. Now, Z had worked for David at the Chicago Evening Post from at least 1867 to 1874, and then for the following 10 years, he served as a railroad agent. He also managed a couple of hotels along the way, and years earlier, he was an agent for a touring musical group that included his talented and accomplished wife. But most importantly, both Z and David, his younger brother, toured the country for 5 years when they were part of the Blakely family, which was a successful musical group which was managed by their father, from whom they must have learned a great deal about managing life on the road. And so this combined experience, along with their sibling tie, probably factored into David arranging for Z to manage Gilmore's band for that fall tour that would bring them to the Twin Cities for the very first time. And when it was finished, Gilmore had a new manager, Z. Blakely. So this is an old poster from the 1880s, and there you can see down at the corner, Z. Blakely, manager for the New York address. And again, Z has been largely forgotten. Like, people know about David Blakely, but they know nothing about Z, as if he never existed, but he was the manager. Okay? So David's involvement, with the great bandmaster at that time was just unclear for the next couple of years, but here's what I've learned. What is clear is that Gilmore's management staff at that time started expanding. This was about 1887, and David was likely behind it. In January of that year, Frank Christianer was listed as an advance agent, and a month later, J.B. Bartlett, who had worked closely with David in Minneapolis, was also connected with the staff. By late November, Howard Pugh, a fellow newspaperman who worked under David, had been added as a press agent, and by early 1888, J.H. Lane came on board as yet another advanced agent. Now, not all of these men were involved in every tour of Gilmore at that time, but they, along with Z and with David, in some sense kind of overseeing everything, were the team that piloted this band, for the next couple of years from this point on. Now, let's just talk about Gilmore's touring for a moment. When Gilmore and his men went on tour, they enjoyed constant adulation. I mean, they were like the biggest draw in the world, kind of like Taylor Swift is today. They were at that time. But life on the road, as you can imagine at that time, was not easy. And so, in the late 1880s, in a remarkably candid letter to David, written by Gilmore, who he refers to David as "my dear general," the bandmaster confessed how exhausted he was, and then he took a sarcastic jab at David's comparatively cushy role. This is what he wrote, and this is actually a picture of the handwritten letter from Gilmore to David Blakely. And in it he says, "But oh, how happy you must feel to simply sit down in your chair and mail telegrams announcing from various sources thousands upon thousands coming in, while I, your partner, have been going through H, F, and B. I read that in a letter, H, F, and B. And then I realized hellfire and brimstone. That has to be what he's talking about. And then he goes on to say, that's all right. You are the right man in the right place, and no matter what the disappointment may be, you have filled the bill nobly. So despite the challenges, their partnership worked. But David was not the only Blakely on the managerial end. Faithfully serving on the road right alongside Gilmore and his band was Z, giving attention to every need and detail. And while David received and perhaps created most of the press, it was, as one newspaper wrote, the Blakely brothers of Chicago, the men who are known throughout the country through their management of Gilmore's band, that brought this world-class ensemble to new levels of success through their tours. However, it was not to last. And this is phase 2. The great impresario moves on. At some point in the spring tour, or after the spring tour of 1891, Gilmore decided to break with David and his staff and go with an untested impresario, or tour organizer, for the band's fall tour. And the reasons for this split are not entirely clear, but there were at least 4 contributing factors. First of all, Z had apparently retired by that time, and maybe Gilmore was just uneasy about continuing on with just one Blakely brother. There's ample evidence, this was fascinating, that suggests that Z was struggling with depression early on in that year, and David, his younger brother, chastised him in an ungracious letter. Here's what David wrote to Z. He said, I do not think that you will ever get well so long as you have nothing to do but think of your troubles and make that your chief business. A month later, after Z failed to respond to that letter, David's concern grew, and he reminded his brother in another letter. He said, it's going to be something of a task to manage Gilmore this time. I hope you're in good shape to do it. And that same day, David wrote to his brother-in-law in Chicago. I actually have a picture of that letter. He asked him to, quote, kindly go and see Z at once and report to me, is he any better or otherwise? Is he able to go with Gilmore and be of any service to us? I haven't heard a word from him for a long time, and I wish you would, if possible, get to the bottom of Z's condition and let me know. Well, when Z finally did resurface in early April and declared that he was good to go, David scrambled and immediately arranged for the money that he would need to get him from Chicago to New York to manage Gilmore's spring tour. But that would be his last. Whether by his choice or David's, that we don't know.
What year?
That would have been 1889 or 90. I should have that in my notes, but I don't have that. It's in the chapter. I just had to remove a lot of the chapter, but thanks for asking. Regardless, at that age, Z was 64, and he had lost his wife 2 years earlier, and he was now entirely on his own, because when David moved on from Gilmore a year later and formed a new band that was led by this relatively young guy named Sousa, his older brother wasn't part of the plan. A second factor that coincided with a split between Gilmore and Blakely was that David was adding new attractions to his managerial plate around that time, including Strauss's Vienna Orchestra, Theodore Thomas's orchestra, a group called the Austrian Juvenile Band, which I found an image from a newspaper from that time period. But the most significant attraction that David secured for a tour in early 1891, while he was still managing Gilmore, was the United States Marine Band under John Philip Sousa. Now, a few months after that time period, Jules Levy, if you know that name, the celebrated cornetist and conductor, sensing an opportunity, approached David with a plea to make him the next Gilmore. Here's what he wrote in part of his letter. He said, and he's writing to David Blakely, he says, why cannot you and I make a deal and you make Levy the future great bandmaster of America? I love his bravado there. If Gilmore is to soon retire, as I hear he intends doing, why should you not take hold of me and make me as you have him? If you could only do this, I'm confident that you would make my fortunes as well as fill your coffers. I love that. Unashamedly greedy. But David declined Levy's request because he was still in communication with Gilmore about working together again in the near future. And so while making the arrangements for a second tour of Sousa and his Marine Band set for the spring of 1892, David corresponded with Gilmore to see what they might do together later that year. And here was his pitch. Here's what he wrote. He said, I'm arranging for an irresistible pageant for next year, which, as you know, is the real anniversary of the Columbian discovery. Am I to have Gilmore's band to build upon, or must I organize one of my own? Well, Gilmore got back to him within days, and the answer was clearly no. But the relationship was not quite over. A mere week later, as he was about to embark on his fall tour, Gilmore wrote to David one last time and revealed that his untested impresario had failed to meet every one of his promises, and Gilmore finally had to take the whole thing off of his hands and assume all responsibility himself. And this led the great bandmaster to confess to David in his letter. He wrote this, he said, I miss your master hand in the business department. But then he added this. He explained why he was not willing to work with Blakely in the following year. Here's what he wrote. He says, why don't you get up something dignified and grand for Columbus and not waste your fame and genius as a great impresario on a circus of war songs which have not the slightest flavor of musical art and can only arouse false and inartistic enthusiasm for the moment. I would not touch the war song Panorama, which was David's proposed pageant, for any amount of gold. I will go into anything with you that has sublime music as its aim and basis. That's what he wrote to Blakely. Now, that last line led David to make a final attempt to restore their relationship. He said, you wrote, I will go into you with anything that has sublime music as its aim and basis. Do you mean by that, Gilmore, that you wish to resume our old relation at the end of the tour? I would be glad of your simple answer, yes or no. But once again, the answer was no. This clash of artistic visions was the third factor leading to the end of their partnership. One final factor, though, which may have been the proverbial last straw, came in October of 1891 when Gilmore had told David of his plan to tour with a monster band the following year. Here's what he wrote to David. He said, I will give concerts in cities that can bear it with the full band of 100 members. And I'll bet you an even $5,000 that I will make it pay big money. I love that. Now, perhaps David should have taken that bet. And let me stop for a second. So, this is something I stumbled upon a few years ago. It had not been seen before. It was found in an auction house. So, this is a lithograph of Gilmore's band somewhere around that time, 1891, 1892, as he was preparing to tour with this band of 100. You'll notice this gigantic tuba in the middle.
Yeah.
This is called the Harvard tuba. It lives up at Harvard University. I've researched the heck out of that thing, wrote 3 articles on it. Apparently Gilmore was planning to use it, but then he gave up, I think because it's really hard to travel with that horn to get it in and out of the train. Anyway, that's a side note for you. I had to throw in a little tuba fun.
Is that a sousaphone further over?
No, there's 2 helicans here, or 4, excuse me, 1, 2, 3, 4 helican basses. There's no sousaphone in existence yet. We're still about 5 years ahead of its creation. All right, now where was I? Oh yeah, so perhaps David should have taken that bet. Remember, Gilmore said, I'll bet you $5,000, I'll make it pay. As Blakely explained to Gilmore's wife a few years later, he said, hey, Gilmore and I canvassed the subject of a band of 100 fully, and I made an estimate of the cost of the tour, as you can imagine, and showed him what seemed to me convincing reasons why I would not dare join him in the enterprise. So there's the final nail in the coffin. And so, no longer with Gilmore, and after an even more lucrative second tour with the Marine Band, David Blakely, that great impresario, as Gilmore had called him, moved on and formed a new band under the relatively young Sousa that would rival the one led by the seasoned leader with whom he had just parted ways. Now, the expectation of making money was clearly driving this new venture. David put it this way, really bluntly to Sousa. He wrote this to Sousa. He says, we are in this thing for glory and money. But how would they pull it off with Gilmore and the greatest band in the world still in the field? Well, the answer would surprise everyone. And this is the third and final phase, what I call either the timely or untimely death of a living legend, depending on how you think of it. David already had experienced staff to manage the new band. It consisted of Pugh and Christianer and Bartlett, names you'll remember that he pulled in to help manage Gilmore years earlier. Lane remained with Gilmore. What was needed now were top players, and by late August, Sousa had received over 500 applications. Significantly, some of those interested were members of Gilmore's band, and David welcomed 4 of them prior to the band's first tour. And while this led some to be concerned that he was poaching players from other bands, David made this strong statement the following year. He wrote this, he said, "I desire most emphatically to say that I never made an overture to any one of Gilmore's men before he died, either directly or indirectly, except on the proviso of his own consent." So, with the band coming together, the next order of business was to finalize concert appearances for the coming months. But then tragedy struck. 18 days into Gilmore's highly anticipated residency at the St. Louis Exposition with his colossal band of 100, the legendary bandmaster died. Feeling ill on the morning of September 24th, he asked his longtime assistant director, Charles Freudenwald, to direct the 4 concerts that day. And during the 3rd concert, a message from Gilmore's daughter, Minnie, arrived at the manager's office in the music hall, and it simply read, "Papa is dead." He had expired of heart failure. And the following day, the entire front page of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch provided the details of this terrible loss. And when the band was finally told, this is what it says on the front page, it says, "The announcement fell with a crushing force, and several members of the band burst into tears and left the stage." Gilmore's sudden death occurred just 2 days before the launch of Sousa's rival band, prompting David to publish this thoughtful response. This is what shows up in the papers. David wrote this: "The announcement of the sudden death of Mr. Gilmore has been received by none with deeper or more profound regret than by Mr. John Philip Sousa, his fellow bandmaster and friend, and by me, who was for years his only business manager. Neither of us can express in words the loss which the country and the cause of music has experienced by his untimely decease." Now, there's little doubt that David accurately represented the new leader's heart towards Gilmore, but David's actions in the following days really suggest that he was more of a callous opportunist than a grieving friend. The New York Times reported this, quote, "2 days after Mr. Gilmore's funeral, manager Blakely, who conducted the Gilmore tour 2 years ago, called on Mrs. Gilmore at her residence and offered to purchase the musical library of the dead leader. It would be of great value to Mr. Blakely, who would, by its purchase, secure just what he needs for his new Marine band and get rid of a rival on the concert field." However, the plan was for Gilmore's band to continue, and in mid-October, a committee appointed by the band elected the respected bandmaster D.W. Reeves to be Gilmore's successor. Now, although Mrs. Gilmore declined the purchase of Gilmore's library, David made 2 other opportunistic moves at that time. First, concerning the recruitment of members of Gilmore's band, he later expressed that, hey, after Gilmore's death, the case was entirely changed, as he felt entitled at that point to go after them, given that he was so long Gilmore's manager. But the interest likely went both ways, especially given David's second move, which was arranging for Sousa to take over Gilmore's annual residencies at Manhattan Beach and St. Louis the following year. Consequently, by mid-February of 1893, 14 former Gilmore players were now, quote, enrolled among the stars of the Sousa galaxy, unquote. And soon after that, 3 more joined them, bringing the total to 17. So 17 of the 50 had come from Gilmore's band. Now Reeves, who at this point was thoroughly frustrated, as you can imagine, right? Gosh. So he fires off this emotionally charged circular titled "An Open Letter to Whom It May Concern, Gilmore's Band Speaks." And in it, he refers to, quote, unscrupulous parties, including, quote, a man whom Mr. Gilmore repudiated for reasons, clearly David, but no names were mentioned, who had created a new band, quote, for the avowed purpose of running Mr. Gilmore from the field. And he added that this man made progress toward his goal in part by securing, and I quote, a few fossiled and worn out members of Gilmore's band.
Wonderful.
Don't you love that? So game on. So the editors of the Musical Courier who published the circular called Reeves' attack, and I quote, a thrust of equally bad taste and bad business tact, as well as a wrathful plaint and an effusion of resentment, and added that, quote, the public will not justify anyone in speaking of such thoroughly competent musicians as those who joined Sousa as, quote, fossiled and worn out members of Gilmore's band. Most importantly, 11 of those so-called fossiled and worn out members who had joined the new band crafted and signed a thorough response to Reeves themselves. And here's how their response concluded. Listen to this. Gilmore's band is now not only destitute of its late brilliant and lamented leader, but most of the soloists who aided him in making it famous, and of the engagements which had been so long identified with his successful career. These soloists and these engagements being now in possession of Sousa's band, and its management being the same as that which piloted Gilmore so successfully the last 5 years of his great career, it would seem as if the question might be an open one, whether Sousa's organization, if he wished it, could not lay greater title to being Gilmore's band. So let me show you a couple of slides here, so just for fun, and I'll give you a handout with this. So here's Gilmore's band in 1889 at the St. Louis Exposition. I can't identify most of them, but 4 of them I can identify. So this is, what's his name? Lefebvre, the saxophone player, E.A. Lefebvre. This is Thomas Shannon, who became the basically the personnel manager for Sousa, playing that giant bass saxophone. This is Herman Conrad, who became the first sousaphone player. He's playing a big old Helican. And then this is Michel Raffaello, the euphonium player. And then fast forward a few years in the Sousa band, and there's those same 4 guys. But again, there were 17 total. I'll give you a handout with that in it. So let me wrap it up this way. When Gilmore died, the Chicago Tribune declared, and I quote, "At the present time, there is no one in this country who is so imbued with such great gifts and is so essentially American in national love and real patriotism who can take his place." The Metronome added this, quote, "The world waited a long time for Mr. P.S. Gilmore, and it may be many years before we finally find another one so true, so warm-hearted, and so popular a leader." Now, both reports were fitting tributes to Patrick Sarsfield Gilmore, but neither of them anticipated John Philip Sousa taking his place in such a short amount of time, while David Blakely somehow did. Writing to Sousa, the young bandmaster, in early 1892, just over a month before his second tour with the U.S. Marine Band, David peered into the future and wrote this to Sousa, and I quote, "One of these days, Sousa, when the great and good Gilmore has done with terrestrial music, he may want to put you at the head of his band. I think there would be a better opportunity for you than even the Marine affords." Of course, when he wrote that, David had no idea the circumstances would play out to make something like that happen. But in the end, they played out perfectly. What if David hadn't pulled in his older brother Z to manage Gilmore's band in 1885? Or if he hadn't assembled that world-class management staff in 1887? Or if he and Gilmore hadn't clashed in their artistic visions for a pageant in early 1892? Or disagreed about touring with a band of 100? And what if David hadn't been so opportunistic and driven by glory and money? And finally, and most importantly, what if Gilmore hadn't suddenly died just 2 days before Sousa launched his new Marine Band? All of these circumstances, quite unintentionally, led to one legendary bandmaster giving rise to another. And we should remember and celebrate them both. So if you don't mind passing one of each of
That
those
was
there.
excellent, Dave. Thank you. Any questions, Bill?
In the Metronome back in late 1880s, they did a poll of the favorite bandmaster in the country. I don't remember who was first, but Sousa came in 4th.
Oh, wow. Yes, sir.
Not meaning to be funny, but I just wondered if it was mandatory to have a mustache to play the band.
Yeah. It's quite a robust mustache.
I just see one person with a mustache.
Now, this image is another one that I stumbled upon. It's actually, I believe it's at one of the libraries at Stanford University, of all places. I had not seen this one before, but I'm pretty sure the lithographer was cutting corners. Because I'm pretty sure, obviously this is Sousa, but I'm pretty sure this is Gilmore's band, because look at the Antonio phones in the front row. As well as two Helicons, Sousa hated Helicons. And so, and plus this outfit, like, that's a Gilmore outfit, not a Sousa outfit. So I have a feeling he just took a lithograph of a Gilmore band and then just drew Sousa in it. I thought that was pretty cool.
Morning, Chuck.
Good, any other questions?
Yes, Wendy?
Yeah. The gentleman who wrote this letter about the fossiled and worn out musicians who went to Sousa, was that the new conductor?
Yep, that's D.W. Reeves, yep.
Oh, geez, okay.
He doesn't use his name initially, he just says Gilmore's band speaks, but then
Oh.
11 of Gilmore's band members are like, we're not speaking. And then in the handout that I've given you that whole trail from the musical courier. You have every single bit of thing they published about it, including Reeves' response where he names himself
Oh, okay, thank you.
in the next issue. Yes, sir.
Because the Sousa band eclipsed Gilmore so quickly, what actually happened to Gilmore's band under Reeves?
Yeah, so petered out pretty quickly with Reeves, and then they pulled in Victor Herbert to lead it. And it actually carried on for quite a few years. And a few of the Gilmore band members that migrated to Sousa ended up migrating back. But that didn't last a super long time. Wasn't really Herbert's cup of tea.